Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today, Carbon and Nature Offsets in the Market for Ecocide. My name is Michelle Maloney. I'm the co-founder and national convener of the Australian Earth Laws Alliance. And this webinar, a very important topic, we're very delighted to be hosting it with our excellent speakers. The Australian Earth Laws Alliance would like to acknowledge that we live, work and play on the traditional lands of the Yagara and Turrbal peoples in Brisbane. We'd like to acknowledge that the work that we do, the work that all of our organisations are involved in, are committed to acknowledging the sovereignty of Aboriginal peoples and working in solidarity to decolonise our hearts, minds and spirits to ensure that how we care for country and how we care for each other in this place together respects Indigenous knowledge, wisdom, and the kinds of things that we all need to do, which is thinking about the earth first. And that's probably a good way to introduce our topic today. Carbon and nature offsets, a very hot topic, have been for many years, but this year we're seeing some policy developments in the Australian context that are both a cause for concern and in some instances perhaps a cause for optimism. AILA is focused on ensuring that we move towards an earth-centred culture and governance system. So we're interested in how law, politics, economics, the whole way that our society exists is gearing towards caring for Mother Earth and ensuring that we pattern ourselves into place. If you took an earth-centred perspective or an earth jurisprudence perspective on some of these ideas of offsetting nature, they would be considered quite an anomaly. The earth jurisprudence way of thinking is that the entire living community, we are basically all a collection of subjects living in communion together. And if you take a scientific point of view, human beings are such a young species. How is it that we have come to the point where we're now creating systems where we are commodifying and further harming the living world? So it's with that perspective in place from my point of view as AILA that I'm really delighted to introduce our three speakers today to address this topic from slightly different angles. So first we'll hear from Professor Brendan Mackey, who is both an ecologist and a very well-respected climate scientist, and he works at the Climate Beacon within Griffith University. We'll then hear from Christine Milne, who is a politician and has been involved in the Greens work for many, many decades. And also Professor Rob White, who is a world-renowned authority on green criminology. And we'll be looking at this particular topic from one of the angles of a working group that we all work on together, which is looking at ecocide, rights of nature and earth-centred law in the Australian context. They are very short introductions because I'm now really pleased to hand over to our speakers. Each of our speakers will talk for about 15 to 20 minutes, then we'll still have a good half an hour for Q&A. As questions come along, please do put them in the chat and I will moderate for us towards the end. But without further ado, I will take the spotlight off Christine and Rob and invite Brendan to come and share with us. We've particularly put Brendan on the spot as the scientist. One of the questions that we want him to start with is, what are these offset things and can nature even be offsetted? But over to you, Brendan. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Michelle, and good afternoon, everyone. I'll just put my I've got a PowerPoint, of course, and I'll just share that and wait for something to happen. Okay, so let me begin by also acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I'm speaking to you from here on the Gold Coast, the Kumbalbara people. And I'd also say that personally I'm going to vote yes when the voice referendum comes up. I want to do that because I want that to be an important step in then developing a real treaty-making process, which is something we urgently need here. So, are offsets an environmental bad as distinct from an environmental good? Well, let me begin by just summarising what I'm going to say. Of course, Michelle's asked me to speak to the science, so that means using graphs and referring to data and stuff, which often can get in the way of what the actual main messages are. So I think in summary that most people buy offsets in good faith or just think they're a good idea because everyone is telling them it's the right thing to do. So a lot of the support for offsets, if you like, is coming from a good, from well-intentioned people trying to do the right thing. And if by offsets we actually mean putting a price on carbon pollution or habitat destruction, then that is a good thing, or could be a good thing, insofar as it acts as a deterrent to change individual or organisations' behaviour, i.e. it's better than not having a deterrent. And this is what happens in New South Wales. You actually get a licence to pollute up to a certain level, and if you're caught polluting above that, you get a big fine, and that money goes into the Environmental Trust, where other organisations and community groups can apply for a grant to do good environmental work. There's no pretense that you've undone the harm from the pollution, but it's meant to be acting as some kind of deterrent. And a lot of the offset schemes that we're actually talking about are really invoking the polluter pay principles, I would argue. But carbon and biodiversity offset schemes, as they're being implemented, unfortunately are really being used as a get out of jail card. Those who are of my vintage would remember the board game Monopoly. I understand there's a web-based version now. There was a get out of jail card, which basically does little more than serve to enable ongoing carbon pollution and biodiversity loss. It's not even acting as a deterrent. Is that point. For carbon offsetting to work, really, it needs. I mean, what has been shown to work is a carbon tax that has been shown to work, or a cap and trade scheme which is fully restricted to the fossil fuel sector under a fixed cap which decreases annually. So both those policies have been shown to be effective. And for biodiversity offsets to work in any way, in my view, they need to be restricted to degraded landscapes alongside policy including law that protects and restores existing habitat. So by that I mean, if you have a development in a degraded landscape, then there should be effectively some kind of biodiversity levy that provides funds to enable another degraded landscape to be undergo some ecological restoration. If we had a biodiversity scheme that was restricted in that narrow way, then it could generate some biodiversity benefits. Anyway, let's go for a quick deep dive into the world of carbon offsetting. But first, I'm going to quickly cover biodiversity offsets. I want to spend most of my allocated time talking about carbon offsets, but very quickly about biodiversity offsets. They're actually defined as measurable conservation outcomes designed to compensate for adverse and unavoidable impacts of projects. That's the IUCN biodiversity offsets policy. Note the use of the word compensation. It's explicitly, that word compensate, again, it isn't saying you will be able to replace what you lost. It's merely a way of compensating for some loss. New South Wales has a biodiversity offset scheme, which they say is for offsetting unavoidable impacts on biodiversity from development through or with biodiversity gained through landholder stewardship agreements. So you destroy biodiversity somewhere, and then there's effectively some kind of a levy. Under it, you are meant to be dealing with unavoidable impacts from the development, i.e. how can you minimise or avoid biodiversity impacts from your development, and those biodiversity impacts that you can't avoid or minimise, they're called residual. That term is a bit of a euphemism because the residual impact could result in the loss of all the biodiversity from the development site. So you have to buy an offset, which can be purchased, or you can retire a credit, or make a payment to the Biodiversity Conservation Fund. And landowners, if you like, generate the credits. They're established under a biodiversity stewardship agreement on their land to generate biodiversity credits. And then the idea is selling these credits to the developers, provide funds to support the long-term management of the biodiversity stewardship site. And an offset site is a location where native vegetation and condition threatened species habitat are protected in perpetuity and can be improved by management actions such as weeding, fencing, weed control, pest control, and planting native species. And an example is what's going on in the critically endangered woodland, Cumberland Plain and Western Sydney. Therefore, biodiversity offsets here require any so-called residual impact on biodiversity from a development. It's offset or replaced by a gain in biodiversity elsewhere by someone else committing to protecting from loss an equivalent amount of residual biodiversity lost somewhere else, a stewardship site, or restore an equivalent amount of residual biodiversity somewhere else from a stewardship site. So we're not actually talking about even replicating the biodiversity that was lost, right? It's not a like for like in an ecological sense. It's an equivalent amount in terms of area or quantum of a particular habitat type. And it's actually either protecting something that already exists or restoring something that was previously lost and is damaged. So what's wrong with biodiversity offsets? Well, I've got three pictures there: Springbrook Plateau, Great Western Woodlands in WA, and the Arnhem Land Plateau. What's special about them? Well, a lot. Which I'll explain in a minute. So, as I said, the argument in favour of the biodiversity offsets is it's a compensatory mechanism for biodiversity loss and development that's better than doing nothing. It imposes some kind of an environmental cost on development, and the buyout price provides a source of fund to do good environmental work somewhere else. As I said, it's analogous to the New South Wales Environmental Trust Scheme. So that's the argument in favour of it. But unfortunately, the biodiversity offsets do not cancel out the loss from the developments. And this is because biodiversity, in toto writ large, is contingent on the kind of evolutionary arrow of time, which develops unique, irreplaceable landscape ecosystems in situ, which are the product of millions of years of evolution, yielding complex ecological communities and genetic information, such as found in the Cumberland Woodlands of Sydney, the Arnhem Land Plateau, the Great Western Woodlands Springbrook. The loss of biodiversity here cannot be recovered or reproduced somewhere else. That's not how evolution works, and it's not what biodiversity is. Kind of so-called avoided loss offsets, where we give money to a landowner to prevent, help them not clear it, actually enables ongoing net loss somewhere else. It's actually a mechanism for enabling biodiversity loss, right? Similarly, terms such as no net biodiversity loss or net biodiversity gain or nature positive assume that biodiversity is a fungible asset, and it isn't because of the evolutionary arrow of time, which develops unique, irreplaceable landscape ecosystems in situ, right? Such as illustrated on the left. Biodiversity is not a fungible asset. So given that we face a biodiversity crisis, the priority must be to protect what we have and restore what we can. And so biodiversity offset schemes could be useful if they were constrained to already degraded land. And like an environmental trust approach, there was an environmental cost on development, even in degraded land, which it's just a development levy, which provides funds for ecological restoration somewhere else. So, my goodness, that's 10 minutes. So what is a fossil fuel offset? Let's talk now about carbon offsets. Well, a fossil fuel offset removes an equivalent amount of carbon from the atmosphere to that emitted by someone else, or it avoids an equivalent amount of carbon from being emitted by someone somewhere at some point of time in the future. In Australia, we have an emissions reduction fund, which provides businesses with the opportunity to earn carbon credit units for every tonne of CO2 equivalent a business stores or avoids emitting through adopting new practices and technologies. And then businesses can buy those credits to offset some of their fossil fuel emissions. I don't have time to go through all the details of the emission reduction fund, but basically someone can create a target by doing that and then sell that to someone who's polluting. So what's wrong with doing that? Why isn't that a good thing? Well, as I said, many people and companies and governments believe in good faith that these carbon offsets do cancel out the climate change forcing of their fossil fuel emissions, because this is what they've been told. And this is a pictograph from the Commonwealth Government website, their Climate Active program, which is encouraging the private sector to buy ACCUs, businesses and organisations purchase offset units to offset their emissions, and there's someone who's generated the credits through avoiding emissions or what's called removing. When we withdraw carbon from the atmosphere, we call it remove carbon. Emissions into the atmosphere, removals from. And lo and behold, the offset units cancel out the emissions. So using that word cancel clearly means that the common sense understanding of this messaging is that you don't have to worry about your fossil fuel emissions causing climate change because you bought a biodiversity offsets which has cancelled them out. And the science of the matter is that is not true. That is not what the science says is going on. They do not cancel the climate change impact of fossil fuel emissions. They can appear to cancel emissions in an accounting sense. So they are actually cancelled out in what I call our national greenhouse gas inventory that we have to report each year to the UN, where we report on net CO2 emissions, i.e. the emissions minus any of the removals. So, and that's an annual net accounting basis. So in those accounting spreadsheet inventories, it is cancelled out, but it's not cancelled out in terms of the additional radiative forcing that's going on in the atmosphere. And if you think about it, buying an offset to cancel out, in a net accounting sense, your emissions only serves to undo the good mitigation work done by someone who's taking mitigation that removes additional atmosphere. So that removes additional atmospheric CO2. So if you do that to generate an ACCU, if someone buys it to offset their emissions in the national accounts, it's undone the good mitigation work you've done. You may as well have not done it. That's actually true for biodiversity offsets as well. If somebody's done some biodiversity good and you buy that as a credit to cancel out in the government records the biodiversity bad you've done, the person may well have not have done the good work to begin with. And also, the only way we have of removing trees or removing carbon out of the atmosphere is through ecosystems and plants. But planting a baby tree to sequester carbon is not an equivalent carbon store to the geological reservoir that the fossil fuel emissions came from. And also avoiding future emissions does not in any sense cancel out prior emissions because there's no removals going on. But I want to say something very quickly about that second last point. As I said, ongoing offset schemes as they're currently done provide the appearance of mitigation progress, but again, they actually serve to enable ongoing fossil fuel emissions and a lower carbon price, which is kind of doubly bad. I don't have time to go through all of this because I'm terribly running out of time. But look, I'm not surprised people are confused. Here's a diagram of the global carbon cycle. It's really complicated. Left-hand side is what goes on land. The right-hand side is what goes on in the ocean, and they're coupled. Who understands that? Only about not many people, I can tell you. But because of that, we're never told this scientific fact that the atmospheric lifetime of the airborne fraction of a pulse of fossil fuel CO2 is really long. Everyone's got in their head it's 100 years. It's not 100 years. And this graph here is shows you how the vertical axis is the fraction of a pulse of CO2 that's still in the atmosphere. You get rid of about 75% of it in 300 years, but it takes up to 30,000 years for the remaining 25%. And that's because, to cut a long story short, each year a small fraction is absorbed from the atmosphere into the ocean, and a small fraction of that flows to the bottom of the ocean. And when carbon is sequestered into the bottom of the ocean at those depths into the sediment, it's effectively locked up in a long-term geological store. So this means any kind of removal from the atmosphere of fossil fuel CO2, you need to keep it out of the atmosphere for at least 300 years to have any significant effect. And of course, the only thing that does that are natural forest ecosystems, right? And again, there's also a flow of CO2, a trickle of CO2 from the land into the oceans through weathering of rock, and that's part of this long-term cycle. So to cut a long story short, you can natural forests are really important because they have a lot. There's more carbon stored in natural ecosystems than there is in known fossil fuel reserves. So stopping logging and clearing forests is really important because it's a really important stock of carbon that's not in the atmosphere. Also, it continually sequesters a certain amount of carbon. But the bottom line here is, if you're going to offset fossil fuel emissions, you have to have some way of keeping them out of the atmosphere for about 30,000 years. And to conclude, in terms of carbon offsetting schemes, to leave you with a simple metaphor, it's kind of a leaf blowing exercise, right? Here's me with my leaf blower, and I don't want those leaves to fall in my yard because I'm responsible for having a clean yard. So I blow them into my neighbour, and my neighbour blows them into their neighbour, who blows them into their neighbour, who blows them into their neighbour. And at the end of the day, there's still a big pile of leaves all at the end of the street. We haven't got rid of the leaves. They're just in the public domain rather than which is the atmosphere, rather than in our backyards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brendan. And a couple of people have asked if this is being recorded so they can go back through your presentation. And yes, it has been, and will be available on our website next week. Brendan, I have many questions for you, but I think what we might do is go straight to our next two speakers so that we can discuss some of these issues that you've raised. Thank you so much. And now, Christine, I will add the spotlight to you. So thanks so much for joining us, Christine, and looking forward to you sharing with us your views about what carbon and nature offsets are able to do and where they're going.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks, everyone. Nice to be able to be with you today. And I too would like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the land of the Muhunina people here in Hobart, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge, of course, that Aboriginal land was never ceded. Now, I was asked to comment on the benefits and risks presented by creating markets for nature and biodiversity. But before we can look at proposed solutions, as in biodiversity and carbon markets, we have to look at what the problem is we're trying to solve. And following on from Brendan's talk on the science, it's just important to acknowledge we live on a finite planet. This is not something that just can endlessly grow. Infinite growth on a finite planet is impossible, especially when that growth is fueled by the extraction of non-renewable resources and the pumping of waste to ocean and atmosphere. We are on a collision course with collapse, and that is precisely why we have the global warming and biodiversity crises we have. We cannot go on as if growth can continue in the way that we envisage it. So we know that prevention is better than cure. When you have a major crisis, or it's possible you have a major crisis, you prevent it happening rather than think you can clean up afterwards. It's much more expensive, it takes longer, and is less successful than preventing it in the first place. Nicholas Stern told us that about global warming. And he also said the longer it takes you to get started in the prevention, then the worse the outcome's going to be and the more expensive. And that's exactly where we've come. And he said that, I think, in about 2005. Prevention means stopping the problem at the source. And the easiest way to do that with carbon emissions is regulation and taxation. Just say no. Tanya could have said no to the Isaac River coal mine, but she didn't. That is the easiest way to prevent any new and additional emissions to atmosphere. Now, if we need, because we need to stop those carbon emissions now, we have to stop those extractive and waste dumping practices that are sending emissions to atmosphere. Now, that's precisely what Rachel Carson with Silent Spring blew the whistle on back in 1962, saying it can't go on. We are polluting the atmosphere. We're poisoning people. As a result, governments got going, and there's a very good summary in Christophe Baumille's notes in his essay, Tell Me Where You Come From and I'll Tell You Who You Are. He says that in response to the need to do something, governments adopted public instruments. So we had parks and natural reserves declared under the authority of rangers to look after them. We had lists of endangered species and they were protected. We had technical standards, norms for pollution and waste established by states and fines for people infringing them. We had a tax system which levied polluters to make them pay, and we had mining bonds, never adequate, but at least that notional view that we used the levers we had to actually prevent them doing the damage. And those things actually worked. But subsequent to the environment movement getting going in the 60s and early 70s, industrialists in the US in particular launched a counter-offensive in the 70s and set about dismantling environmental regulation and set about undermining air pollution standards and established instead an air pollution market permit system. And they paved the way for biodiversity offsetting mechanisms. So this all came out of the Ronald Reagan era. This was neoliberalism fighting back against direct government intervention in the market. So the major industries got together and they formed anti-environment coalitions. They developed new think tanks. They had new ideological slogans. They updated strategies for communication, legal disputes, lobbying. And essentially they attacked the legal grounds of environmental regulation, fostered counter social movements to confront environmentalists like the Wise Use movement in the US. They cast doubt regarding the scientific grounds of ecological problems like the IPA does now and the Heartland Institute. They questioned the economic costs of environmental regulation, and they overrode the way we used to think about the environment and turned it into something that was about economic rationality. They spread knowledge and bywords that promoted private property and market mechanisms. And so all of the language we get now is straight out of that right-wing think tank era in America, and it's neoliberalism. And that is what we are living with. The conversation in Australia about offset markets, biodiversity markets, and globally is straight up neoliberalism thought up by the big polluters to enable business as usual for destruction of the environment. And that's what's happened in Australia. Game, set and match, actually, because both major parties just parrot it constantly. Instead of stopping the problem at the source by intervening in the market, we have abandoned prevention. Instead, we permit business as usual, pollution and destruction, and all we decide through the market is how much of a cure for those problems is necessary. And then if it is necessary, how much is affordable. And it's the classic, we are all dealing with the consequence of a neoliberal economic frame imposed on us. Federal and state governments have not only permitted all this, they've facilitated it in exactly the way that the major industry players designed and promoted. So how it's happened, they've subsidized logging, mining and fracking. We have a lenient tax regime so that the coal and gas industries pay no tax. We have perverse incentives like exploration subsidies. We've got cut budgets for nature protection and management. We've set low water quality, air quality standards. We don't even have minimum vehicle fuel efficiency standards. We fail to enforce compliance anywhere, including under EPBC. We have to take the government to court to force them to actually enforce what's in the weak existing laws as we have. So now, as a result of all of that, 50 years after, 62, so it's that many years after Rachel Carson, we have a State of Environment report in Australia, which says that overall the state and trend of the environment of Australia are poor and deteriorating as a result of increasing pressures from climate change, habitat loss, invasive species, pollution and resource extraction. So having facilitated global warming and nature decline through neoliberal policies and market-based mechanisms, the federal government now says it can't afford to solve the problem. And instead, Minister Plibersek and Minister Bowen, instead of having a blue sky debate about how to prevent the problem of increasing fossil fuel emissions and biodiversity collapse, and what sort of intervention the government needs to engage in, the neoliberal and business have actually set the boundaries on what is considered politically possible, realistic, necessary, desirable, and what is not. And it's why you have Minister Plibersek on television saying it's unreasonable to stop new coal and gas. That's because it's in this frame that's been said about what is politically possible, necessary, achievable. They say it's not politically possible to go further than 43%. They say we have to have green Wall Street because we can't afford anything else. And that decision is made by the industries who donate to the political parties and set the parameters in the back room. Those industries agreed to 43%, and that is why it is not higher than 43%. Nothing to do with the science, everything to do with those industry parameters. And many in the environment movement have been sucked into it too, saying, oh, well, it's only politically possible. It's a step in the right direction. Well, it's not a step in the right direction if it goes nowhere to dealing with what the problem is and if it enables business as usual, which it does. So now that we've got the coalition supporting Minister Plibersek with the nature repair bill, we're going to have a nature repair market, whether we like it or not. And the question I pose is, why would we think adopting an extreme neoliberal solution to a problem that neoliberalism has created will work? Because it simply won't. The safeguard mechanism and the nature repair bill are just simply attempts to flick past responsibility and funding for the protection and maintenance of nature and natural systems, to flick all that to the private sector. So I argue that there are no benefits and only risks in commodifying and monetizing nature in a market that's deliberately designed to have a lose-lose outcome. And as Monbiot says, the reason you can't do this with biodiversity as much as anything else is that an ecosystem is a holistic system. There are different elements that depend on each other. You can't unbundle them and trade them separately because the whole thing collapses. So I argue that carbon offsets are a ticket to pollute. The safeguard mechanism gives social license. In fact, not only does it allow pollution, it gives social license to the immediate release of new and additional fossil fuel emissions in spite of what the science says. So I say it is a ticket, a green light to ecocide in that sense, and exactly the same with nature offsets. They are tickets to legitimizing destroying biodiversity. And if you want to go there and think about that, I'll just add a couple of points about what else is wrong with the nature repair market. First of all, it's not permanent, transparent, or accountable. There is no evidence that tradable certificates are an effective method of protecting or restoring biodiversity or serving the public good. They have to date failed and have been shown to be had double dipping and fraud, rorting, poor governance, and so on. And that has been particularly the case in New South Wales. You're setting up a whole complex structural edifice to consult, to establish, to regulate, to measure, to certify, to contract, to trade, to report, monitor, account, audit, enforce, and administer. And in the middle of all that, it's opaque, open to major errors, nepotism, and corruption. So that is absolutely my take on where this is going. It also lacks permanence, because the biodiversity gains will be able to be reversed after 30 years. So what is the point in this, going ahead with something that you can reverse 30 years on? Finally, why would a for-profit business invest in biodiversity certificates or credits when they're not legally required to do so? They never do anything unless they're legally required to do so, because they're required to maximise their profits. So one has to assume that what we are lining up for is the Commonwealth will buy these certificates, and their purpose is for offsetting corporate destruction of biodiversity under the EPBC Act. And so my question to the Minister is, if it's not intended that an offset market for biodiversity certificates or credits is developed, then they should rule it out now, because they haven't actually ruled that out. They haven't ruled it in either, but it's actually what's going on. I might just go to the other issue, which is the regulator. It's worse still that the Clean Energy Regulator will be put in charge of the proposed market. Now, they've got a poor record overseeing the carbon market, as the identification of fraudulent human-induced regeneration offsets and baselines has shown and has been demonstrated by Andrew McIntosh at the ANU. People are getting credits for not clearing forests that were never going to be cleared, getting credits for growing trees that are already there, getting credits for growing forests in places that will never sustain permanent forests, and so on. And whilst the government has said it's going to look at that, that mechanism and change it to something else, they have not removed the dodgy credits that are already in the market that were generated by this fraudulent scheme. So that is why it is so much cleaner and easier to go straight to a direct intervention. We're in an existential crisis. We need direct intervention. And interestingly, the government perceives we are in an existential crisis with China, and war is on the cards. And so they didn't go to an offset mechanism and a market-based mechanism to fund submarines. No, they went straight to a prevention is better than cure, direct intervention in the market, and spent $368 billion. So it's a question of priorities. It's a question of what you think is a national security risk, an existential crisis. And if you think you've got one, then you go for direct intervention. So in my view, the government should withdraw the nature repair market bill, because it's bad policy, it's a waste of money, it's a driver of corruption, and it will maintain the state and trend of the environment as poor and deteriorating. I think they should set new biodiversity targets and goals consistent with target 1 to 8 of the post-2020 biodiversity framework, to which Australia is a signatory. They should underpin those targets with strong new environmental protection legislation and regulations with enforcement and compliance provisions that look to protecting functioning ecosystems and restore degraded ones. They should develop regulations straight away to end land clearing, native forest logging, develop higher water and air quality standards, waste disposal standards, strengthen extraction of water regulations, regulations for the eradication and management of invasives. I've accidentally muted, sorry. They should also, so just about threatened species plans, they should immediately fund those, not just a few of them, but fund the whole lot of the threatened species recovery plans. introduce legislation making ecocide a crime in Australia and support the same in the International Criminal Court. I know Rob's going to talk about that. Abolish all the subsidies that contribute to ecosystem species decline, including all fossil fuel subsidies. There's absolutely no evidence to say it's beyond the capacity of government to fund all this. They spend 11 billion annually on fossil fuel subsidies that could be immediately redirected. They could abolish the stage 3 tax cuts that would fund a whole lot of this work. They could increase the bonds that the mining industry has to pay for rehabilitation so that they're at least realistic and the community is not left years down the track to pick up the mess. They can strengthen the emissions reduction targets consistent with the global science and the pursuit of 1.5 degrees. And they need to integrate climate and biodiversity policies and targets because they're two sides of the same coin. It's no use just talking about renewable energy and ignoring the impacts on biodiversity with the rollout of large-scale renewables. It's exactly the same biodiversity destruction, whether it's a mine or whether it's anything else that clears a critical habitat, which comes to the question of, it's not a question of just maintaining the lifestyles we have, the demand levels we have, and switching to renewables. It's about reducing demand and looking to what we actually need rather than what we actually want. And the final thing is, why would we want to go over and fight on the territory of the big polluters, which is what we're doing by having all these debates in the context of markets? Why wouldn't we say that battlefield has been a loser for the environment for the last 50 years? We are now going to return to direct intervention in the market and actually have the fight between two clashing hegemonies, because that is actually where we're at right now. And I do not want to see any more of the environment movement generally continuing to just compromise and compromise and compromise, because in the end, you are left with nothing. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. That was excellent and very informative. And there's lots of comments coming in, people saying that you've nailed it. It's exactly how they feel about the trading and the marketing of our precious biodiversity. I'm now going to ask Rob White to join us and to share his thoughts, and then we'll open up to Q&A. Thank you very much, Christine and Brendan.
Okay, I'm actually going to pull the lens out a bit further and, in a sense, elaborate on some of what Christine's just said, actually, but by pulling the lens away from the detail to the broad strokes. But I want to begin by acknowledging the Palawa people of Lutruwita, the First Nations people of Tasmania, upon whose lands I stand, and I acknowledge their elders past, present, and emerging. And before I begin, I was just struck that part of the political debate today, you get no sense that we're in the midst of crisis. And this crisis has two huge components. One is time. We're running out of time. There's an announcement today that as of 2028, we're going to go past 1.5. And that should give us a sense of the urgency of the action that it's needed. The second component of the crisis is the scale. And this is global in nature. And it's the scale of the harm is something that we've never seen before in the history of humanity. So let's start with this as our basic premise, that we're in the midst of a massive crisis. We're running out of time. We seriously don't have time to muck around. And the scale of the harm that we're talking about is massive. So the question I'm addressing today is, why aren't we doing what we need to do? And it's a question I've asked of the IPCC reports many times as well. That is that the scientists have come up with a whole range of measures, both mitigation and adaptation measures. And then you look around the world and you think, well, hang on, we're still going backwards. We're still increasing the global heating and things are accelerating. So what's wrong? And part of the problem, if we go back to Christine's statement, is with neoliberalism. And more broadly, it's global capitalism. But basically, we can't just reduce the human condition to market exchanges. And also, let's get rid of this notion that there's something like a free market. There isn't. There's no such thing as a free market. All this kerfuffle that's happening out of Canberra at the moment is trying to construct an artificial market that actually reflects the very power interests that are creating the problem in the first place. So let's get away from this idea that the market's the solution, because in fact, the capitalist market is the problem. Again, let's go to the real world of crisis. And the crisis is not ecological, but it also is across a range of other kinds of measures. We're seeing wages and income sources declining for the vast majority. We're seeing huge disparities in wealth and government responses to debt. We talk about the billionaires, and the amazing thing, we know these people by name. And you think that's really sad. We can talk about Bill Gates. We can talk about Elon Musk. We can talk about Gina Reinhardt. We know these people, but basically that highlights the sheer power and strength on a global scale that these people now have. We've also seen the disenfranchisement of large layers of the working class from the democratic process. We'll come back to that in a moment as well. And also increasing efforts by states worldwide to restrict democratic participation in places like Tasmania with anti-protest laws and so on, and in Victoria and in New South Wales, and the list goes on. So basically, if you want to talk about crisis, then we have to talk about crisis as a social crisis, as well as a crisis of ecology. What we're seeing, and this is progressing more and more, is authoritarianism, which is affecting all types of decision-making. In a global capitalist society, what we're seeing is structural authoritarianism. I'll translate this in simple terms. More power and decision-making is in the hand of a small number of billionaires who are making decisions that affect us all. So what, how, and to what purpose social production is carried out, how it is distributed, remains in the hands of a small elite minority that's further concentrating as we speak. So it's the billionaires calling the shots. It's the heads, the CEOs of the transnational corporations and so on. And that is a form of structural authoritarianism. In other words, we ain't got a say. It is fundamentally anti-democratic. We're also seeing worldwide the tendency towards political authoritarianism. Now, we've seen it in Turkey, we've seen it in Hungary, we've seen it in the United States under Trump, we've seen it in the Philippines under Duterte and so on. And basically, it's the shrinking of the democratic franchise in a variety of ways through a variety of different kinds of mechanisms. We're seeing it played out in the UK at the moment through the quite perverse rules relating to ID and which IDs get the count if you're going to a voting booth. If you're an older person with a train pass, you're okay. If you're a young person with a train pass, you're not. So it's the shrinking because basically the right and the conservatives are threatened by grassroots democracy and democracy in general. We're also seeing, of course, a world that's driven by a growth agenda and profits. I'm not going to read all the slides and so on, as you can see, but basically the bottom line is profit. So it's the economy that's driving everything. It's not ecology. And I think what we have to do eventually is counter the economic argument, which is basically at the behest of private profit, and talk about the public interest. One way to talk about the public interest is to talk about what's happening to the planet. And we come back to that notion of crisis. And ecocide as a description just says, basically, we are doing great harm to specific territories and indeed to the earth as a whole. How do we measure that? Well, we do it through analysis. We have the scientific reports. We have the World Meteorological Association. We have the IPCC reports. We have a range of reports that provide the scientific evidence and trend analyses that show us the immediate and the near future harms related to global warming, to the diminishment of biodiversity, and to the pollution and contamination of our air, land, and water. So ecocide in this sense is descriptive. It says basically we're stuffing up the planet, and we have tons of evidence that shows that. In response, people have been trying to say, look, we need to talk about more than simply the description of this harm, but actually talk about it as a crime. And so we want to use a language that signifies the environmental ecological harms that are occurring. And the language that's being adopted more and more is the language of ecocide. Ecocide basically says that humans are creating the damage, that we need to stop the ecocide. And so Stop Ecocide International, for example, an expert body came up with a definition proposal relating to basically harm. It's saying that where we have this kind of harm and it's widespread long-term damage to the environment, then people need to be held accountable, because there's so much shit going on today and nobody's being held accountable. Very, very few people. We can extend the concept of ecocide to include eco-justice, so that we can talk about ecocentric criteria as driving our concept of harm. Let's include the non-human. Let's include the rivers, the mountains, the birds, the trees, my dog Matilda. These entities should be considered part of who needs protection, and indeed who needs to be valued. And again, going back to something that was said earlier, when we talk about ecology, when we talk about biodiversity, we've got to talk about totalities, ecological interrelationships, that you can't separate stuff out. There is that notion of totality, and of course, the notion of intrinsic value of nature. One of the key things, if we're going to talk about a response to these crises, if you're going to talk about adopting ecocide as a crime, one of the key things that we have to bear in mind is that the continuing centrality of the state. What we've seen in recent times is indeed the centrality of the state, particularly in terms of the COVID crisis, but also the global financial crisis. So the question is, if the state is that central and that important, then we need it to be our state. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But the centrality of the state argument is really, really important. And here's some examples. Rapid political shifts are indeed possible. So if you think of the global financial crisis, there was a lot of immediate, right, bailouts of industries. And in the UK, the taking over of banks, which, if you look at it slightly differently, it's a de facto form of nationalization. Hey, we're going to bail out the Scottish bank. So in effect, it's our bank, but then they give it back after we bailed them out. The pandemic, the adoption of Keynesian economics by conservative governments all over the place. We had here in Australia, of course, massive spending in relation to the pandemic. And what it demonstrates is two things: the centrality of the state, but also the way in which we can move quickly if we prioritize where we want to go. We've seen it with war. People say, oh, you can't change capitalism. You can't, how do we deal with the billionaires? Well, the dispossession of Russian billionaires is one of the things that came out with the policies that were adopted by different state governments. So basically, rapid political shifts are indeed possible. We can do it. I would argue that if we want to deal with the crisis today, then we need our state to take over the central levers of the economy. The 6 pillars of social life: water, air, food, energy, shelter, and security, means, look, decisions are too important to be left in private hands, that is the billionaires and the secretive state, the bureaucrats and the self-serving politicians. Governance needs to be public, open, cooperative, and democratic. What we're pointing to here is a political challenge. And the political challenge can be wrapped around the notion of the rights of nature, for example. So ecocentrism refers to the rights of nature. We need to measure the harms against the earth. We can intertwine notions of ecocentrism with the idea of the duty of care, an environmental duty of care, and relating to care and duty of care is intergenerational equity. And of course, Ecocide talks about criminalizing those actions which are destroying our planet. So there's a way to come up with a rhetoric, with a proposal, with a position that says ecology should be central, not economy, in the narrow sense of economy used by those supporting markets. There's a series of guiding principles and concepts we need to be aware of. Yes, we have progressive work that can ameliorate the worst, most regressive aspects of contemporary practices, but that's not good enough today. We actually do need transformational interventions. The crisis has gone too far. This is not a time for gradual change. This is a time for transformative change. And basically, it boils down to this. The two key elements for social change today: transformational nationalization, take over the central levers of the economy. We need the control and management of our air, water, land, and energy. Take it out of the hands of the private sector, put it in the hands of us. And now these are debates happening as we speak. So for example, in the UK, the water situation, the freshwater situation, the pollution in the surrounding beaches around the UK is so dire that it is actively on the political agenda again in the United Kingdom. So we need to also put it back on the agenda here in Australia. That is, who's making the decisions and in whose hands should these decisions be made? A radical democratization is part of this. That we need to fight against the billionaires basically making all the decisions. So it's structural and political authoritarianism we have to fight against. We need to expand democratic participation in decision-making in relation to both social and ecological needs. That, to me, is the agenda. If we want to go to the recommendations that Christine's put forward, then in fact, you have to take these issues on as the underpinnings of the struggles that lie ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob. I will now bring all of our speakers into the spotlight, so to speak. Brendan, if you could turn your video back on, that would be terrific. Then I can spotlight you and people can see you. So thank you for three very connected but very different points of view. We've got a couple of questions in the chat, and a couple of questions are emerging across the themes. First, I might start, Brendan, you talk about, and I love your analogy at the end about leaf blowing, this idea that shuffling around our offsets and moving effectively carbon into a big pile of leaves at the end of the street is not going to be working for us. A big emphasis in the work that we do within AILA is, what are our alternatives? From your point of view, as someone who is heavily involved in everything from community education around climate change to IPCC reports, are you seeing any countries or approaches that are sidestepping market-based responses and seeing something a bit more effective, perhaps more along the lines that Christine's talking about, good old-fashioned regulation, or anything else that you're seeing around the world that's doing better than these approaches?
Well, you know, as I mentioned, carbon taxes have been putting a price on carbon has been shown to influence behaviour. I mean, it's kind of interesting. I mean, you know, an economist would always tell you to follow the money. So there's an interesting website now, which I'll just put the link into the, it gives you a kind of real-time update of our national energy grid and where the sources of energy are coming from. And basically during the day, about 50% of our energy from the grid is coming from renewable energy sources. Right? And at night time, it gets down to about 20%. So on average, it's about 30% over the course of a 24-hour day. And that's already happening. And that's just private, I mean, that's just where the private capital is going into renewable energy. That's without any government policy or law. And that's just because wind and solar and battery are, you know, far more cost-effective ways of generating electricity than coal and gas. So, you know, gosh, it wouldn't take much to have a government policy that actually help fast track that tradition. I think we've got to put a price on carbon. It's been shown to work. you know, the idea of a cap and trade scheme within the fossil fuel sector is that you could get some more cost-effective reduction, but we have to have a complete firewall between emission reduction in the fossil fuel sector, whether you do a straight carbon tax or some kind of cap and trade scheme with the declining scheme, and what we do with the land, because the land is the only place that does removals. Natural forests are the only carbon capture and storage system we have, and they're already, you know, their capacity to do that's already been halved in Australia, because we've lost half of our forests, and every year we log about 2% of them, when we're keeping them as baby forests and preventing them reaching their carbon storage capacity. So the first thing we have to do is just put this firewall in our carbon accounting between fossil fuel sector and the land sector. And we need to have a completely separate set of targets and a whole different approach to accounting. In the land and forest sector and agricultural sector, you need stock and flow accounting, not just flow accounting, which is only relevant to the fossil fuel sector. So, you know, the carbon taxes have been shown to work, and the big problem we've got at the moment is allowing offsetting between the fossil fuel sector and the land and forest sector, and this kind of net accounting approach. So
Thanks, Brendan.
That
Yeah.
would be my answer there.
Yes, no, and of course, Christine, you talked about the need for direct intervention, and you articulated beautifully the problems that we see with neoliberalism, pretending that the market-based structures are the only framework within which we can make decisions. The big question, and it's popping up in the questions here, and I'm sure it haunts us all, is even if we wanted to move in that direction, how do we, in today's climate of often corporate control or influence over government policy, how do we try to make government entities believe that this is an appropriate response and that they can do it without corporate interference or punishment?
Well, it really goes to reform of democracy, as Rob said. As long as political donations determine the policies of both major political parties in Australia, we are not going to see progress in these areas. That is just a matter of fact. The gas industry is in the back rooms writing the regulations in relation to the petroleum resource rent tax. When it comes to any of these industries, if you look at the night of budget night, there they are having dinners at $5,000 a table or a head, or, you know, anyway, astronomical sums. That is not the community. That is our budget, our Parliament's budget. That is for the community, and it is being sold to the corporate interests around Australia to raise more money and to give access to those political players. So the broader agenda of reform of democracy is critical, and political donations is critical. But to just go to one example, the logging industry. Right at this moment, the native forest logging industry in Australia is on its knees. It's on its knees in Tasmania, Victoria, New South Wales. Western Australia pushed it over to some extent, although they've still got problems with the mining industry logging over there. But let's just concentrate on those three states. In those three states, the government-owned logging entity is making up to $50–60 million loss every year. They are driving not only the loss of biodiversity, but an even greater loss in the sense that an intact native forest is more resilient to fire. If you log a forest, you make it more vulnerable to extreme weather events. We know that El Nino is coming. We know more fires are coming. Why wouldn't we now move to put take away the regional forest agreements, put the logging back under the EPBC? Why wouldn't we stop subsidising native forest logging in the budget every year and knock it over once and for all? The tragedy is, along come people saying, oh, I've got a new idea, just when they're on their knees and we can actually push them over. I've got a new idea. Why don't we just calculate the carbon in those forests and sell it off as offsets? And along come major donors and go, oh, how fabulous, we can put millions into this idea. It's actually propping up the native forest logging community at the very time we're in a position to knock it over. And why would you create those offsets? The only market for them is to offset fossil fuels. And as Brendan said, that's one of the biggest problems at the moment. The offsetting goes from nature-based across to the fossil fuel sector. So you might feel good about creating some credits out of a forest, but how good are you going to feel if that results in Scarborough going ahead, or Beetaloo going ahead, or Middle Arm, or whatever it is? So we have to get real here. We have a moment in time right now to go get people on the streets, to overturn the anti-protest laws, because I think that the governments know that the community's angry, they're sick of it, they know that markets are a con, they know this offsetting is a con, and people are ready to take to the streets. And that's why they brought in the anti-protest laws, to protect big business. So I think we have a moment in time where in one industry sector in Australia, the community has the power to knock it over. And they have the power to knock it over because it's in their votes. The question that all these governments ask is, how many votes are there in it? How many votes is it going to change? How many marginal seats? Start thinking about the issues in the way that they think about the issues, not in terms of the integrity, because they're not really concerned about the integrity. It's the votes.
Thanks, Christine. I'm looking through all of the questions, and I think all of them link to this. They're saying, Kristen has said, I love Christine's analysis of neoliberalism as a driver of market-based responses to climate crisis. But the private sector hasn't just taken over nation states. It's also a significant shaper of global climate politics, including the COP, which now champions carbon markets. How do we confront this challenge? And I'll just, before you answer, any of you, this is an open question to the three speakers. All of these questions from folks are saying, absolutely, we need to do this stuff faster. We need to get people out onto the streets. How do we do this? How do we organize this? And someone else, how do we make the government know that we want the government to do the things for the people and planet, not just for big business? There seems to be a lot of understanding that we need to make the change happen, but there's this remarkable, hideous break between what people want the government to do and our ability to make the government do those things. So I'll start with you, Christine. You know, how we talk about protests, yes, but when it comes to the corporate control of climate policy, how do we challenge that as ordinary people?
Actually, can I comment on that?
Yes, Rob, please, Rob, fire away.
Because and I know you're probably going to laugh, but we don't want a stadium in Hobart, stick it up your bum. Basically, that campaign is really, really quite significant in its own way. It was across all parties. So you had people speaking at the rally. There were 6,000 people. They were supposed to organize in 1 week, right? So 1 week, we had 6,000 people, which for us in Hobart's a lot, on the lawns of Parliament House. We had Greens speaking, we had Independents, we had Labour, we had Liberal. We had people from local government, from state government, and from federal government, all represented and reading out and speaking and so on. We also had people from the northwest of the state, from the north of the state, from the south of the state. And if you looked around at the people who were there, we had people of all ages and all backgrounds. Now, why were they there? For a whole range of reasons, but a key reason is, and well, let's say why we weren't there. We all agreed, the whole crowd agreed that we want an AFL team. But we disagreed with having to spend $1 billion on a stadium that we didn't need, that we didn't want, that we didn't get discussed, we didn't know the details of, that was imposed upon us, that was bullied into us by the AFL acting as a corporate bully and so on and so on. Now that's an analogy, I think, of the kind of thing that we can generate and we must generate when it comes to the climate action, that we have to get that kind of cross-sector movement, but importantly, it was directed at somebody, and it was directed at key figures. It was directed against Murdoch, for example, in the Murdoch press. It was directed against the AFL as a corporate bully. It was directed against the Albanese government for its funding. It was directed against the Premier of Tasmania, and so on. In other words, it's not, oh, let's sit around it and somehow be united. We were united against somebody and for something. And we wanted something else that we wanted to do with our $1 billion. So I think in an analogous sort of way, that's the kind of politics and the kind of movement that we need.
I couldn't agree more, Rob, but I do think we have to be aware that people coming together for a one-off construct around a sporting entity is a little different to the decades and decades that people have already been battling it out on the climate change front, and the feeling that no one's listening and that those protests don't make change, as well as protests being locked down. So I agree with you. And if it took just one big gathering to make a difference, I think we would have stopped the Iraq war back in the 90s. But Christine and Brendan and Rob, how do we continue to try to shift public policy in Australia or around the world to reject the notion that business as usual is okay, and that we can use our leaf blower to shuffle things around, when in fact what we need is much more significant intervention and a much greater recognition that fossil fuels have to be stopped and that we have to do these other actions around land management. Christine, you've been in the political world longer than myself. What do you think could work in Australia to get this kind of recognition by government of its potential role to move away from neoliberalism?
Yeah, we need to radicalise civil society. Now, Rob touched on that a minute ago. People have mistaken signing petitions and clicking on things on the internet as activism. It's not. It's an indicative thing, but it's not activism. It's not the same as standing outside the minister's office. The fact of the matter is the ESD, the Ecological Sustainable Development Campaign, took people off the streets as part of this neoliberal shift. And it happened after the Franklin. The Franklin succeeded because thousands and thousands of people joined a blockade and said it is enough. And Bob Hawke saw it as enough to promise a change. And so there was a change of government and a change of policy in relation to the Franklin. It hasn't happened since because governments have taken the environment movement and civil society off the streets. They've had internal consultations. The environment movement, the social justice movement, the peace movement are taken into Parliament House. They're talked to, they're patted on the head, they're given minor concessions, and they're sent away again. And the public has no idea. The current housing crisis is a classic. You know, why are the groups who represent civil society not standing there actually saying this legislation is rubbish and should not be passed? In the same with the safeguard mechanism. Why was the environment movement largely there saying, pass it, just pass it, it's a small step, just pass it? The just pass it brigade have to stop. And if you're a member of a civil society group, you need to get on the phone to them and say, why are you facilitating an agenda which is leading to ecocide, which is accelerating the climate disaster? And as far as the COPs are going, it needs to have a major boycott of this year's COP, in my view. Civil society ought to just boycott it, because having a COP in a petro state where the focus is carbon capture and storage is about the biggest indication you can have that the COP process has failed the planet. It's the only one we've got. It's failed the planet though. And if NGOs attend that COP, then they've gotten away with basically what they set out to do. So it's time for civil disobedience. And the older people need to get onto it, because yeah, they've criminalized, that's one of the problems, they've criminalized protest. And so young people risk a criminal conviction, and that means that they won't get visas from some countries, they won't be able to go to the bar, there'll be a whole lot of issues if you have a criminal record. Older people who've retired ought to be out there protecting their grandchildren and taking it on their behalf. So I think we need a grey revolution in Australia. I'm up for it.
Any other comments, Rob, Brendan? If you've seen the chat, you'll see that many of these questions are about this issue. How do we make this action happen? So thanks, Christine and Rob, particularly for suggesting that we get out there and continue to do what has worked in the past. We've only got about, sorry, Brendan.
Yeah, so, you know, I mean, I'm a scientist and speaking, you know, I can't speak to the politics, you know, Christine and Rob, that's their domain. But certainly, you know, I would just stress that the IPCC science can and should be lent on.
Yeah.
Again, there's all sorts of attempts to undermine its validity. A lot of nonsense is said about governments interfere with it. I mean, it's just not true. The full reports, there's 3 working groups, one looking at the climate, the science of how the climate system is changing and how we know it's due to what humans are doing and how it might change in the future. The second looking at the impacts of that climate change and the vulnerability of human and natural systems and the kind of adaptation that's possible, including the limits to that and the loss and damage and the irreversible impacts. And the third is on kind of looking at mitigation pathways under different kinds of economic scenarios. And all of that is based upon purely an assessment of the peer-reviewed published literature. That's all it does. It doesn't make anything up. It synthesizes and assesses what we know based upon the kind of main process we have for advancing kind of scientific knowledge about stuff. Now, those full reports involve, each of those 3 groups involve about 300 experts, and each report is between 2,000 to 4,000 pages long, right? And governments do not interfere in that process, right? They are what the scientists say. Each of those has what's called a summary for decision makers, which is a short 30-page summary. So 4,000 pages is condensed down to 30-page summary, and it's meant to be plain English, and it's meant to be in policy relevant language. The science authors draft that, then there's a plenary session where the government reps go through line by line, and the authors have to show where in the full reports the evidence is for that statement, etc., etc. And then once that's all agreed to, the governments accept the summary for policymaking reports and all the full scientific reports in full. And every Australian government since 1992 has accepted the IPCC reports. So they are limited because they're limited to what research has been done and what's got published, but they're the most authoritative statement we have, and they can and should be lent upon. And I would just urge people to go to the website and at the very least read the summary for policymaker reports. And all the statements are quite clear. There is no alternative to rapid and deep cuts in fossil fuel emissions. Right? There isn't any alternative in terms of limiting global warming to any level. And the risk is the longer we wait to do that and the less we do it, the more we trigger these mega irreversible positive feedbacks, which take us to a very, very bad place. The thing, just to pick up on Rob and Christine's point finally, current mitigation policies as implemented is still going to deliver us 3 degrees in 80 years time, by 2100, right? So there's a massive challenge ahead.
And I think part of what is evident from this is that we have to get our heads around the fact that this is not politics as usual. We talk about economics as usual, business as usual. Well, we need a politics that's not as usual, because we have to get out of this impasse. We don't have time for reform politics. We only have time for transformational politics. So we have to be much more radical in our orientation. And I think that what we need to do is change our mindsets, like really fast.
If I can just add to that, Rob, there was big excitement after the last federal election that we would have transformational politics, with a whole lot of the Teals being elected on a platform of climate action, the Greens being elected on a platform of climate action, David Pocock as well, and so on, and having balance of power in the Senate. People were excited about that. So why didn't it translate into more than 43% when we knew that 75, 76% was what was necessary as a climate target, when the numbers were there to do it? And secondly, why did the safeguard mechanism get passed without the critical amendments? Why didn't people say if it's not amended, it shouldn't pass? The nature repair bill, why has everyone written things saying, yes, it needs amending, but it's a step? You have to enable people in politics to take a stand, to be radical. What happened was all of the groups, or not all, I should say, the Australia Institute was an exception, but the overwhelming majority of groups went into the back rooms in Canberra and said to the Greens, the Teals, David Pocock, all of them, yes, it's not as good as it should be, but this is as much as Labor's going to do, and so we urge you to pass it. And so those people would have had no political cover whatsoever if they'd voted against it. An avalanche of perfect being the enemy of the good would have fallen down around their ears. And so at the end of the day, they passed things they knew were bad because they didn't have any political cover from the community of people who ought to know better. And instead, that community of people backed the government. So we actually have the potential right now for radical shifts, transformational shifts, because we've got people in the parliament who are up for it, but they're not being empowered to take the radical steps because they're being dragged back from there by the very constituency that ought to be facilitating it. And when Rob talked about that rally in Hobart at the weekend, one of the reasons so many people turned out and were excited was the day before the Liberal Party in Tasmania lost its majority. 2 people crossed the floor, and so suddenly the political opportunity became available and people were excited and came out. So it just shows you, if you create the political opportunity, there will be people who step up. And that's my frustration at the moment, is that the people who could be backing radical transformation and saying, don't pass it unless it's much better, are in the just pass it brigade. And that is fundamentally where we have to make the shift to take advantage of our current scenario.
That's probably an excellent point to wrap up on. There's a number of other questions, but we might have to leave them given the time. Perhaps just the final question from people like myself who are deeply concerned about the direction that some of these commodification of nature policies are going in. Right now, what would you suggest that folks do about things like the Nature Repair Bill and some of these other mechanisms? Write to their local members, read articles. Someone actually asked Christine if they could get a transcript of your presentation in this talk so they could see your analysis. I think you've also published just recently some similar articles, haven't you?
Yes, I've just written a response to the Nature Repair Bill for the Green Institute that will come out shortly. But just to disappoint people, I'm sorry that David Littleproud has said the coalition will back Labor in supporting the Nature Repair Bill, so it will go through and it will be browned down even worse than it is now to facilitate the coalition. So Labor had the choice, green it up with the transformational thinkers in the parliament, or brown it down with the coalition. Coalition wrote the Nature Repair Bill in the first place. It's David Littleproud's bill. Labor's picked it up. They will do it. So whilst submissions are useful, they're not going to change because Labor want the coalition on their team.
All right. Well, look, we might wrap it up now, but I think it's a topic we'll come back to, certainly within AILA, and I know many people are working on this issue, but we'd like to have further discussions about what ordinary people can do to support their local members, their local groups, and wonderful folks like yourselves. So Christine, Rob and Brendan, thank you for your time. Very diverse kind of discussion, but I'm sure many people know a whole lot more about carbon and nature offsets. I think the conclusion is, generally speaking, they are going to help us push towards ecocide. There are other more direct intervention approaches that we could do, and let's hope that it's not too late for many of us to come together and push that forward somehow. So thank you so much for your time, everybody, and everyone in the audience.